Hi everyone, and welcome to the Betty Eats podcast, where we talk about real recipes created by real people, not AI. And we have a special guest on today. We have Sophia coming to us from Brussels, of all places. And so thank you so much, Sophia, for staying up late. There's a little bit of a time difference, but I'm super excited to talk to her. Just to let you know a little bit about Sophia, she is a longtime recipe developer and food writer, but she is also a lawyer for a tech firm. So I'm amazed. You're a very busy lady and raising kids. And so I'm super excited to talk to you about how you develop your recipes and just how you go about fitting everything in. That's very inspiring. So welcome to the program, Sophia. You know, I want to start off by asking you how you sort of arrived in doing multiple things. You know, obviously you have been cooking a long, long time. I read a little bit in your bio about really from childhood you have been cooking and been exposed to a lot of different flavors. And so maybe you can tell us a little bit about that journey and then just kind of how that journey's gone.
Sure, happy to. And, first of all, thanks so much for having me. Very excited to be here and looking forward to chatting. Yeah, I grew up in sort of, 80s, 90s, Western Germany. Not exactly known for interesting flavors or intriguing recipes. The sort of, meat and veg and potato kind of cuisine. But my parents, were pretty, well, foodies long before the term foodie really existed. They spent a bit of time living in Morocco before I was born. And so for me, growing up, there was always a bit of orange blossom water in our fruit salad. Sort of a Sunday roast, we were more likely to have like a Moroccan meshwi or maybe like a couscous royale. If friends and family came for, the German coffee, like coffee and kuchen, like coffee and cake, we were more likely to have baklava. Like hummus was part of our Christmas meze spread long before you could get hummus in supermarkets. And so that was sort of the setting of my childhood. And at the same time, my mom, who's a phenomenal home cook as well, she just thinks that, learning how to feed yourself and feeding yourself well is one of those essential life skills. So she made sure that me and my three siblings learned how to cook from a really young age onwards. And she always encouraged us to experiment in the kitchen as well. And some of those experiments did not go well. I can't recommend putting blue food coloring into vanilla custard. It just makes the whole thing look very moldy, as we discovered in our primary school years. But I think that's sort of where that all started. And then I've always been very studious and, went to university, did law school. And I think for me, cooking then became very much a creative outlet. And it was really a chance encounter with a cookbook author at a supper club that led me to start my food blog. And initially it was terrible restaurant reviews that thankfully nobody really read because I was a complete no one. And that very quickly morphed into just developing my own recipes.
Oh my goodness. Now, you mentioned the supper clubs, and that is something that you did for a while, actually, with your friend, right? And you also, did you do catering as well around town? Or, is that kind of how you sort of got started also in that, is through the supper clubs and doing some baking?
It was really a mix of things. So Kaya, a friend of mine, she now lives in Stockholm and she actually runs a cookie business. And we met through Instagram and one day met in person and then very quickly realized both of us kind of wanted to see whether our passion for food and developing recipes translated into something in real life. And so this idea for these supper clubs came about. But even from the beginning, it was a mix of, some events were more cooking classes, some were sort of pure supper clubs, but there was always a bit of a teaching element to try and introduce folks to new ingredients and new cooking techniques. And we then started being approached to start catering events as well. So we did some sort of offsite events for smaller companies, did the sort of tapas spread in the evening when they finished their offsite sessions. And we did a pop-up at a wine bar. We were invited to cater the baptism or like the lunch following the baptism for friends of ours. So there was a bit of catering, but the focus was more on the supper clubs.
That's, it's funny. I have seen supper clubs pop up and that just appeals to me so much. But at the same time, it's kind of daunting, a little bit overwhelming to think about how do you go about doing this. And I know it's harder with kids too, because you're trying to juggle multiple things. But is that something that you feel like you would maybe go back to at some point, is hosting supper clubs again?
I think I would love to because it is daunting. It is a lot of work, but I think it's really fun. And I think probably one of the reasons, aside from actually really enjoying my day job as a lawyer as well, that I never really went into the food industry is that it can be really, really hard work nonstop. And I'm seeing that my nephew is training to be a chef at the moment and he's loving it, but it's so challenging. And then also depending on where you end up, there is less focus on the creative side and a lot of sort of execution because, you have to get the dishes on the table in a certain amount of time to keep the restaurant functioning. And so I think what we really enjoyed about the supper clubs was that we could come up with any theme that we wanted. We could come up with any sort of dish that we wanted. And if there wasn't much interest, then we would run that menu just once and then move on to something else. And if people really liked it, we would do multiple events with the same menu. And so there was a lot of creative freedom. And at the same time, we could sort of pick how often we wanted to run them and really try and fit them in with our schedule. That being said, it took up a lot of time and essentially all of my weekends and evenings. And at the moment, I've got 2 young kids. I've got a 4-month-old baby and an almost 3-year-old. So like at the moment, that's just not something that's feasible. But I would love to do it again. It's phenomenal fun.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe incorporating kids into the mix somehow. I don't know how that would work, but yeah. Oh, that's exciting. Well, so that's so interesting that you obviously love your job as a lawyer and then you've also got your food writing as well. How do you balance that really? Because I think that I can imagine being a full-time lawyer is, you put in a lot of hours, but do you find your recipe development and your food writing, is that mostly done on weekends or do you have a flexible enough job that you can kind of mesh the two? How does that
It's a really good question. I think it's a mix of things. So at the moment, I'm like in some ways because I'm on maternity leave and my second son, he's still so tiny, he sleeps a lot. And so that gives me, some time to research recipes and do a bit of writing. I think when I'm working, it's really in the evenings and on weekends, and weekends also being sort of during nap time. Because my job is somewhat flexible, but it's sort of more flexible in terms of when you do the actual work, which is quite a lot. So it can be challenging. But I also realized that I think during the pandemic, how we all cooked and ate, that changed a lot. I think a lot of us were cooking more than they ever have, myself included, because suddenly, like literally all of your meals essentially had to be home cooked, at least for a while, until restaurants figured out how to do sort of COVID safe deliveries. And then I first son and my inspiration to cook and to develop recipes sort of tanked because there'd been so much cooking during the pandemic. And then I'd been, I don't know, just so tired during pregnancy and postpartum that it just took a while for it to come back. But then it really came back. And now it's gone back to this source of joy in my life. And I guess you make time for what's important to you, even if that sometimes means sacrificing sleep or sacrificing other things.
But yeah, I think that's so true with the pandemic. I think everybody did have to sort of figure out a lot of things. And I know their big sourdough craze kind of started as well. But I think it also got people back interested in cooking, experimenting more with different flavors or trying different things because it's kind of like, well, why not? We have the time. And I've kind of found that even with cocktails, like I learned how to make cocktails during the pandemic because it was we're not going to go anywhere. So, and it's like, well, it's a Wednesday night and obviously we're not going anywhere. So, yeah.
That's amazing. I wish I knew how to mix cocktails. I just sort of mix together what tastes nice. Did you discover any new favorites during the pandemic?
Oh, I did. I discovered that I actually like whiskey, which I was sort of surprised.
Okay.
I didn't really, I had worked in a winery, California winery, many years ago. And so I knew about wine and I enjoyed wine, but, spirits and cocktails weren't something that I had a lot of, but I used to be a ghostwriter as well, and so I worked on a cocktail book.
Fascinating.
And so it gave time, the pandemic gave a lot of time for experimentation and learning things, and so it's fun. There's also wonderful cocktail books out, like Michael Ruhlman has one called The Cocktail Ratio.
Yeah.
Really a gold mine to understand, like you're talking about mixing things together, of why certain ratios work and produce a lovely drink. So
I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, I recommend it. It is really, really good. Well, so part of what we talk about on the podcast is recipes, and with the advent of AI produced recipes and a lot of untested recipes floating around online, everybody's posting them. What do you find that when you are looking at recipes, you sort of have a checklist in your mind of things to look for or things to watch out for? I know that in the past guests have talked about, especially bakers have talked about, is this in grams or not? That's a big one. But what do you look for when you're maybe searching a new recipe? What are some of the hallmarks?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it depends a little bit because I find that I think there are certain elements in a recipe that make it more likely that I'm going to trust it. And of course, if it's a well-known author, I'm more likely going to trust them. But, mistakes slip in anywhere and everywhere. But I do find that if somebody is, if the ingredients are listed in the order in which they're used, that is nice. If there's really detailed description as to what to look for, and, it's not just something has to cook for 5 minutes or something needs to be in the oven for 20 minutes, but I get some sort of visual clues as well as a time element and a description as to what it's going to smell like, or what color the crust is going to have. I think that helps because it also shows me that hopefully the author isn't making that up, but they've actually tested enough to be able to give you all of that information. I think similarly, if they quite openly talk about possible substitutions and what cannot be substituted or why something doesn't work, or if they also say, I've tested a vegan version as well, but, don't use X, cream cheese brand because it won't work. I find all of those things help to indicate that something has probably thoroughly been tested and the recipe's been carefully drafted. It doesn't mean when those elements aren't present that a recipe is not going to work, but I'm just more likely to trust it. I think the other thing is, especially with baking, if you look at different recipes for the same thing, and you see that a lot of them have sort of similar ratios of the key ingredients, then something that is a complete outlier but doesn't explain why it's different, I'm less likely to trust that recipe because I have not a lot of reason to trust that recipe. And similar, I think after a while you just start developing a bit of a feel for what makes sense in a recipe and what doesn't. Like I saw a shortbread recipe in quite a famous Greek cookbook the other day, and it mentioned a cup of malib. And malib is this spice that I really like. It's the kernel of a certain type of cherry, and it tastes a bit sort of marzipan-y, bitter almondy. And you do need a decent amount, but more sort of tablespoons, like not cups for a cookie recipe. And when I saw that, I really thought, well, that is clearly a typo. And I can now try and work out exactly how much to use, but that just can't be right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point about outliers, I think, too, because, sometimes, like you said, when you do come across something and you think, oh, this is different and innovative and maybe, that's going to put a fun twist on it. But then you realize, oh, maybe not. This might be a typo or just not a good one. Well, I noticed that in your recipes, you do love to explore a lot of different ways of using things. Your most recent post about fig leaves was so intriguing to me. And I'm guessing that part of that is from, your growing up, using a lot of different spices and things like that. So where do you get your ideas to experiment with some of these things? How does that come about?
Yeah, it really depends. I mean, it can come from anywhere really. I mean, sometimes it's, reading about certain dishes. Sometimes it's trying something in a restaurant. Sometimes it's simply, realizing, one of the things I really enjoy baking with is Chinese spice powder, which is more commonly used in, savory cooking. But it's full of spices that you can find in, English mixed spice, in sort of French pain d'épices, in the German Lebkuchen mix or pumpkin spice mix. And then it's that, I can feel something going off in my brain sort of saying hang on, but if there's so much overlap, then maybe, you can also use Chinese spice powder to make sort of gingerbread type cookies. And then you try it, and if you like it, you sort of take it from there. Or I really like playing with sumac as well, because it's, it's something that I'm always going to have in my cupboard, whereas lemons or limes, sometimes I have them in my fridge, most of the time, but not always. And then I thought, well, if I want to add acidity to something, what else do I have? Can I use vinegar? Can I use verjus? Can I use sumac? Can I use tamarind? And then trying that out and seeing what works and what doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because I
Yeah.
feel like all of us, we have so many ingredients in our cupboards. We have so many half-finished jars in our fridge and our pantries. And, I hate wasting ingredients, but it's also just really fun to learn how to make most of what you have.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's so true. I know the other day I opened my fridge and, the side doors on larger American fridges, you probably know, are usually filled with condiments. And I opened the fridge door and something was about to fall out. And I was like, there's so much stuff. And I just looked at all the condiments on the door and I was amazed. I mean, I'm counting them and it's like, oh, I have like 30 condiments just on my fridge. Am I using all of these? So I love that you're like, let's not have this go to waste and let's find other ways to use it. And I love your idea too about savory condiments in baking because that's not something you really think about very often. But, like you said, it's so true. You can use things like tamarind or sumac that go with fruits and other things like that. So do you have some favorite ones that I saw your white chocolate and za'atar cookies. Those looked amazing.
Yeah, I love those. I mean, that was definitely a complete random idea, which I then realized isn't so random at all because, I mean, that literally came to me when I was biting into a manouche, which is this Lebanese flatbread that's topped with like za'atar oil. And then when I started Googling it to see whether maybe other people had tried that, I realized there's apparently like an iced coffee drink at Dunkin' Donuts in Saudi Arabia with za'atar and white chocolate. So not as unique an idea as I would have liked or thought. And I had no idea whether I would like it, but it turned out really delicious. And I keep on hearing from people who've tried them and they will say it really works. And so sometimes you just also have to be open to new ideas and then some of them work and some of them don't.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, like a lot of people, I really like using miso in baking because it's sort of not just savory and salty, but I feel like depending on how you use it, can be a bit malty in flavor, almost like malted milk powder, like if you add it to custards, for example. And it's just this more complex, like savory note than just using salt. And I think soy sauce actually does something similar, but obviously has a sort of stronger salty flavor, so you can't use quite as much.
Right. And do you think that's because they're fermented? Do you think maybe that's why there's, that element, that kind of malty element in it, maybe?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, yeah, and it's so interesting about that white chocolate and za'atar. Going back to that, you forget, like in other countries, even big conglomerates like Starbucks, they have very country-specific flavors and country-specific combinations. And so, like, I would not have known that they had that in Saudi Arabia, but now we can try that and see, what that tastes like. So I think that's really neat to be able to remind people of all the different flavors that can be combined together. So, yeah. Well, that's fun. So, what are you working on now? Like, what are you working on potentially a cookbook or other type of baking series? What are you excited about right now?
Yeah, a couple of things. So always working on new posts for Substack because I really, really enjoy writing the newsletter. And so working on some new recipes, one of which is going to be a sort of morning glory muffin 2.0, trying to streamline the ingredients a bit, but add in some sort of modern pantry ingredients or, flavor bombs. So I just started testing that. And that should go live probably later this summer. And then, yes, I am trying to work on a cookbook. I've written a proposal and now trying to find somebody to represent me and hopefully take that forward. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, that would be a dream of mine come true.
Oh, that is exciting. Yeah, I would love that cookbook because I know you have such a great just mixing of flavors and like you said, exploring all the different condiments that we already have in our pantry that we could be using in other ways that we don't even know. So, well, usually people provide a tried and true recipe. Have you thought about what you would like to share with listeners as your tried and true recipe and maybe talk a little bit about it?
So the recipe that I picked is for a preserved lemon drizzle loaf. And funnily enough, this was inspired by the Starbucks lemon loaf because I used to travel a lot for work. And whenever I'm not organized enough to prep my own breakfast, I'll grab something from the Starbucks at the airport because there's not much choice when you fly out of Brussels. And I remember just being so disappointed by this cake because it was so dry and had this quite artificial lemon flavor and this sort of greasy glaze. And I just thought, I must be able to do better than that. And so the cake I came up with, uses both oil, but also yogurt, which gives it just this sort of additional moisture, and the cake stays fresher that way. And then I blended in some preserved lemons into the yogurt, because I really like baking with preserved lemons as well, because again, because it's fermented, you get not just sort of saltiness, but you get a lot of complexity. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that when you buy preserved lemons from a Moroccan shop, they're actually a specific type of lemon. They're not just any sort of regular lemon, but they're really small, round lemons native to Morocco that have a flavor similar to bergamot lemons. So they're quite perfumed as well. And it just gives this cake this additional note, because you get these like tiny, tiny little sort of almost sherbety nuggets of the preserved lemons. And yes, there's some saltiness as well, but it's really subtle. Like, it's just sort of more flavorful in the cake itself. And it's just a really lovely cake. It's got a really velvety, moist crumb, because it gets a syrup drizzle at the end and has a nice glaze as well. And it's sort of my answer to the Starbucks lemon loaf.
That sounds delicious. And I loved preserved lemons too. I didn't know about them until just a few years ago. And I had bought a jar of, it was preserved lemon, like a paste, I guess. And I thought, oh, where's this been all my life? And so I have a lemon tree. And so I thought, oh, I wonder if I could make these. And so I have been making them, but they're the giant big California lemons. They're not the perfumey Moroccan ones. So my result is not quite the same, but they are so delicious, and in so many applications, like pasta and, like you said, a lemon loaf, and yeah, and that's something that's really nice to have on hand as well. So now, do you also use your preserved lemons in other applications? I'm sure you do.
So one of my favorite dishes to make is a tuna ragu with green olives and preserved lemons. And that's based on a dish that I had at Tail Up Goat in Washington many years ago. And again, it adds this sort of, I don't know, sherbety, lemony, like really perfumed note. And it just contrasts really nicely with the fish and the olives. I love adding it to sort of garlicky yogurt as well, to have with like kefta and grilled meats. And then you might know that there is a Italian sort of dish finisher called gremolata, which is typically just like lemon zest and parsley and garlic. But you can take the same idea and use, cilantro and chopped preserved lemon and garlic, and then use that to finish any other kind of stew where you think those flavors work. And then I like making like a yogurt mousse, like a sweet dish, but yogurt mousse with preserved lemon as well. I use it quite a lot.
Yeah, lots of applications. Well, where's the best place for people to connect with you? I know, maybe talk a little bit about your Substack newsletter, and then other places where people can contact you and connect with you and find your recipes.
Sure. I think the best place to connect is on Substack. I write a weekly newsletter. It's a mix of recipes and things like my ingredient spotlight series, where I take a single ingredient and try to talk about, what it is and how you can use it, and share some recipe ideas, both my own, but also plenty from lots of other talented folks. And, if people have comments or questions, I always try to respond to them, be it through the notes part of Substack or directly in the comments. And then you can find me on Instagram as well, same username as my Substack, and I link to it as well in every single Substack post. And those are really the best places to find me.
That's great. I'll put a link to those also in the show notes. And I didn't realize that you and I both love Ottolenghi. I have several of his cookbooks, and I follow him everywhere he is on, social media. But yes, that is really a wonderful, wonderful series of cookbooks to cook from. And I see little glimpses too. There are some, some of the things that you use, I can see the influence there, but you use them in a different way. So I love that. That's fun.
Yeah.
I read a little something that you were maybe going to work for him at one time, or were applying to work for him at one time.
Yeah. So I think I also come from an Ottolenghi obsessed family. Like, we have, all of us have various of his cookbooks, and I think there are a number of dishes from various Ottolenghi books that are now sort of family staples, that we keep on going back to. But yeah, I mean, one of the things I was always so intrigued about with Ottolenghi is that there are these like super lengthy ingredient lists, but you know that, he's tested them within an inch of their life. Like there's a reason why it's an eighth of a teaspoon for ingredient number, 17, and it's like 3/4 of a teaspoon for ingredient number 25. And so when I was developing my own recipes, at some point I thought, like, I want to learn about this. Like, I want to ask the guy, like, how do you know when to stop? And so I don't want to work in any of the delis. I don't want to work in any of the restaurants. Like, I want to do a stage in the test kitchen and basically find out how they know, like, where do you draw the line? Because things can always be improved. And I also know that, no recipe is set in stone, right? It's a recipe is a sort of, it's what you then start with in your own kitchen to adapt it to, what you have and what you like and how you like to cook. But still, like that was my motivation. And I emailed them a couple of times, essentially saying, I'm a lawyer, so I'm, good at note taking. That must be helpful in a test kitchen because you have to document what you're doing. But I don't have a lot of sort of culinary skills yet. And they were super kind, and they just said, sorry, we don't really do any internships or stage in the test kitchen, but feel free to, come and work in one of our delis, which I probably should have just done, but I was like, no, like I want the test kitchen. This is where I want to be. And I tried again a few years later, and the response was the same. So I take that as a no.
But it is inspiring, though, like you said, to really kind of drill down, like, why is it an eighth of a teaspoon versus half a teaspoon or whatever it is. So do you also follow Helen Go? She was a co-author on Sweet. Yes, I love her recipes as well. They're so interesting and well thought out, and so from a little different perspective.
And I'm also fascinated by, because she's a psychologist by training, and so I'm always fascinated by these people who have this like whole other life before they get into food, or like sort of keep that up as well. Like I know her new book coming out is really about combining baking, and I think her background in psychology, so I'm really curious to read that. And yeah, I love the flavors that she combines. So yeah, a huge fan of Helen as well.
Yeah, but that's also kind of like you. You have, your law degree and you're combining that with food. And so kind of a kindred spirit there. So, well, thank you so much, Sophia, for coming on today onto the podcast and just sharing a little bit about your recipe process and your life as a food writer and how you balance that with just life as a mom and a wife. And so thank you for just sharing that. I'll put links to everything in the show notes so that people can find you. So thank you, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been great fun chatting.
Thank you.